This week, perhaps a reflection upon the Mercury retrograde cycle, but more so the consternation of the use of the astrological tool. Each week, I take a chart. Let's get a chart here. And this is basically almost a generic chart in that it starts with Aries, there are whole sign houses, and it proceeds around, which leaves out a rather significant factor when considering the astrological dance. And that is that each house, 12 houses in an astrological chart, represents experience. Various, 12 kinds of experience, or I should say 12 fields of experience that, each one can be rather broad in what it represents. But more to the point, when I look at a chart like this, it's like I can't give you a house perspective as to carrying a meaning that is relevant at its most profound sense in the astrological, unfolding process that each birth moment brings. And I use that each birth moment because that's exactly what a chart represents, is the birth in any particular creative moment of something that has been initiated. And the houses that form based on the house system you're using, because we astrologers tap into all kinds of different house systems. You could say that this is a house system. It's a whole sign house system. And, there's a relative ease with which looking at something like this can carry some weight. But today, I have a certain discomfort. Maybe it's the Mercury retrograde working through. I was born with Mercury retrograde, conjunct Mars, 8 minutes apart in Aquarius. So I'm going to step out on a limb and I've chosen a particular chart to look at. Today's July 4th, so yeah, you guessed it. I'm taking the Sibley chart, and because I was weaned on the Koch house system, that's the system that I have this set up in. Now, here we have houses to play with, experiences to look at. And since today is the, what shall we call it? It's the day that the Declaration of Independence was voted on. That was created in its language to represent the 13 colonies of the American continent in 1776. It wasn't actually ratified till August 2nd, but the words were, formulated on this day, finalized. So that's the birth of this Declaration of Independence in language. Now, this is a Sagittarius rising chart. All right, over here, Sagittarius. And the ascendant in any chart it represents that initiation point. It represents let's back up a step. When you look at a basic chart, you've got a horizontal line running across the chart and, theoretically a vertical line. These are the main axes in a chart, and they represent 4 quadrants of experience. Everything below the horizon in the chart has to do with the discovery of self. Who am I? How do I fit into this matrix of the living dance most effectively? And there's no guarantee that the calling of spirit, which is what it is that creates each birth for a particular need at that time of being successful. We have to interact with our culture and aspects of the living environment that we're born into. So there really isn't a guarantee that we're going to actually realize most effectively what the need we were born for is. But it's always there. And everything below the horizon is, as we determine, the need that the time requires, everything below the horizon is our discovery of ourselves. How do we understand ourselves? Now, everything above the horizon has to do with the other, the experience of the larger whole that we, are invited to participate in and determine, how can I best utilize and play the need that I was born for in the larger context of the social civilization that I find myself a part of. Basic stuff. Each quadrant represents a certain, what should we call it, a part of that experience, Discovering yourself. First house is kind of like, it's your I am house. It has a certain be quality. What does it mean for me to be me? Okay. In this case, it's Sagittarius. What is the context of this being, the Declaration of Independence that was born at that time, to be Sagittarius? What is the perspective of a consciousness that is inclusive of multicultural perspectives? How can I best utilize my understanding of ways to integrate how it is that I'm going to get along with others, no matter what their particular cultural paradigm represents? And it's ruled by Jupiter. Jupiter, over here in the 7th house. We've reached the land of the other, 7th house. In contact, close connection with Venus, a planet that can represent, the other. That representation of partnership. Can you feel something kind of magically working here as this Declaration of Independence was formulated into this particular birth moment that was an invitation for these 13 colonies to step up to the plate on the global context with a vision for how to best integrate itself into the culture of the planet, of the human part of the planet. Well, Jupiter is basically just a spit over 3 degrees from going into the 8th house in my particular house system. So it takes on more than just the version of exchanging energy with others, but is the perspective of how to use. First house is a B house. Second is how do things get used. And third house is along the lines of how can things be transformed or understood. And that's same thing here. 7th house is how is the being process unfolding in the experience of interaction with others. 8th house, how can we use that energy most effectively to, carry on business, interact in the level of shared ownership, personal ownership, shared ownership. And that Jupiter, ruler of the first house, says this experience of my presentation, Declaration of Independence, of what it is that I am aiming for, we the 13 colonies, sets in motion at Sagittarian flavor. I'm going to read you, the first couple paragraphs of that Declaration of Independence, because I think it's important to grasp how these words arrived on the page at that particular time. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impelled them to the separation. The things that have been going on with the kings or the leaders of the United Kingdom at the time are spelled out pretty substantially in this Declaration of Independence. I'm not going to go into that. I want to just capture the essence of that particular energy that these 13 colonies were putting out. We hold these truths to be self-evident. This is one of those sayings that, it's epitomal, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We're all familiar with that phrase. Now, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. It's from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. Times were challenging for the 13 colonies because, it goes on for the next, couple pages of the grievances that they had, basically suffered through in putting together this new country. And this is the establishment of the people in charge of these 13 colonies, stating quite clearly that we want a more even, reasonable position in the world context, the global context of participation with all of humanity, all the countries. You feel the Sagittarian nature of that? Can you feel that Jupiter 7th house with Venus, seeking, some level of, somewhat equal entwining of energy with others, no matter what their cultural differences are, to participate as, relatively equal players in the global context. Second house, ownership. What are things worth? What is required for survival? Well, we have here Capricorn as the flavor of that house. Ruler, Saturn. Saturn's up here in the 10th house. In Libra, there's our Venusian signature again. But from the 10th house perspective, think of governance. Think of control factors. Think of, Saturn can mean some kinds of restrictions, but there are reasons for the strictures being in place. Governance of our resource base, because essentially the United Kingdom was just using their colonies as a way to, suck value out of and return hardly anything to them. Pluto, which just within the past couple years has gone over this same 27 degrees of Capricorn, is the planet of substantial transformation, You feel the potential intensity of the need for transforming the value structure for the security of the colonies away from this, usurping power of the United Kingdom's, hard-pressed energy pushing down upon them with, serious over-control energy. Third house. How is our form of communication to work? It's an Aquarius house. There needs to be some level of humanitarian perspective. There we could go back to that Sagittarian ascendant. The thing that is being born in this moment is the requirement of understanding of intercultural perspectives. And here we have the moon in place to feel into that energy. There's a certain discomfort of the feelings that their people in the colonies were having for being so oppressed by a dictator, a tyrant kind of energy. This is all, the development of the self, everything under the horizon. So in this discovery of ourself, we get to the power line. This vertical line is the power line. Horizontal line is the consciousness line. So we come to the power of, what is it? Home. It's ruled by Mars, because it's an Aries house. Where's Mars? Mars is up here in Gemini, in the 7th house. So what does the god of war and strife and potential, impulsive kinds of energies feel, 4th house, about home? Where is the power there? Well, the power is in partnership, 7th house, in Gemini. It needs to be talked about. And this expression through the Declaration of Independence is that conversation going out, or that has transpired to develop this Declaration of Independence. And we can just go on. Each house an experience of things. Something is being born still in Aries. What is being born? Partnership. Partnership on Sagittarius. A global level for being on somewhat equal grounds with the rest of civilization, being invited onto the world stage. And then, in this chart, you can kind of see there's a lot of planets. 7 of them. 8 if we consider Uranus, because Uranus is, just a little over 3 degrees away from that cusp, which basically easily moves it into consideration for, that revolutionary energy in the experience of engaging with others that is, percolating, shall we say. But 8 planets above the horizon, here's a group of concerned people setting in motion something that they essentially were putting their lives on the line, because this may or may not succeed in establishing their independence. But they had to do it. It was time for this birthing process to transpire. And since we've got, this consciousness line here with Uranus on it. It's like my consciousness can't continue along the lines of the way things are going. A revolution is necessary. And then we go into, what is this experience of partnership going to entail? It's going to entail, a very dynamic, potent, and driving kind of energy as to the communication that we want to have with others. And Venus and Jupiter together? Oh, Venus and Jupiter together. I was born with Venus and Jupiter together. Same distance apart, 2 degrees. And so the experience of that Venus-Jupiter in the realm of the 7th house, it has a larger drawn together kind of energy that wants to be included in a perspective with the cultural experience of the globe as full participants in everything required at that level. The sun, that, vibrant energy of, presence in this realm of what are the ramifications of partnership at that larger global perspective level that are going to be required. Well, if you go to the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. There's a concern for the people of Britain, which is different than the government. We have warned them from time to time. Okay, that was the paragraph just before the last paragraph. Last paragraph. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by authority of good people, of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. These members of this Congress, setting forth this birth new opportunity, did recognize that they were putting absolutely everything online as far as what would transpire next. It was a gutsy move. Maybe that has to do with that Uranus and Mars, not necessarily that close together, but both in Gemini, both tickling that seventh house experience of what is it that this Mars-Uranus energy, which, by the way, yesterday, on Friday, were exactly conjunct at 3 degrees of Gemini. This energy is in the air right now, particularly here in the United States with our 250th birthday, which is why I chose to look at this particular chart. Something in the collective is seeking to be born. And this birthday of the Declaration of Independence is a time for us to really ask some penetrating questions as to what is it that we were born as a need, a particular need that we came to offer at this time on the planet. And have we been effective enough in that, or have we been distracted by some of the things, things, the things that our current culture, has trained us in so many different ways to feel are required in order for our survival. I don't know if that's entirely true. I think that there have been quite a substantial amount of distractions from what it is that we were born to bring as answers to why we are here. As a cultural collective, as human beings with our different perspectives, to compare notes and ask rather profound considerations as to, are we really providing that better place of existence here on the planet? Is our life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness perhaps been hijacked by economics, greed, a extreme disassociation from our environment and the environmental footprint that we are placing on this planet? Okay. When you look at an individual chart and you look at the experiences that each house represents, each week when I look at the chart, the vast variety of individual perspectives as far as experience goes is going to be unique for each one of us. We're each going to experience that seventh house interplay of the dance with others based upon what the sign is for that house, where the ruler of that particular sign is, and the environmental and family experiences that have formed our perspective on that interplay space that we share with others. Whereas, I look at this chart, seventh house is always Libra. It always has to do with Venus. Well, that isn't necessarily the case at the individual level. So this week, I'm just going to quickly through this week. There are really only a couple things that stand out. I can't always say that with, I'm going to say it with tongue in cheek, that, we're in our Mercury retrograde cycle. And as I pointed out last week, it's a little more intense of a Mercury retrograde cycle than normally because it only covers about 10 degrees of the zodiac. And so there's a focus of energy. In that Cancerian realm, what does it mean to be at home? What is home to you? And the reconsiderations, Mercury retrograde, of those factors are asking us quite particularly, are you comfortable in what it is that your version of home is presenting to you? And it's Mercury. Is there some thoughts about that? Even though Mercury retrograde, the potential for meaningful conversation with others at this time is challenged because people get into their myopic, I'm only thinking about the things that are going on in my head. I'm having a hard time listening to you, Mercury retrograde, with forethought, with a capacity for being an invitation to share energy with others and, break through that version that, doesn't really want you easily to be able to hear what others say. Practice listening. This is an ideal time to do that because it's not necessarily going to be easy. But if you can do it, the potential for hearing things that you had not anticipated is there. We go through the moon. It's waning square at the same time that it's going to square the sun in that version of getting to the point where, have I been effective in what my intentions that I set at the beginning of this lunar cycle were? And, this crisis in consciousness of that waning moon is sitting there with Saturn, because we're in a Mercury retrograde cycle. Be gentle with yourselves when this crisis of consciousness being influenced by Saturn in the sign of Aries might be bringing things onto the surface of your reality that have to do with Mars and Uranus in Gemini close together, creating possible discomfort, possible considerations of revolution. And why, might I ask, would these revolutionary thoughts have the potential of taking hold? That's going to be for each one of you to answer. Because, from some of our perspectives, there's some pretty substantial imbalances that are at work at the global level of the reasons for why we are here at this particular time on planet Earth that require a rebalancing. There's some really out of balance factors as to why is it that it seems like a lot of us are just eking out a subsistence level of survival when, you know, we know, we just know there is a more balanced and efficient utilization of the resources that are available on planet Earth than what seems to be the case right now. Why is it, painted that we are heading toward a resource overuse zone? And somehow we're struggling for the experience of being alive. We can't afford this, that, and the other thing except for a small quadrant of folks that for some reason seem to be in positions of control with enormous levels of resource that nobody needs. And they don't care about us that are, ironically, part of the reason for them to be able to be in the position they are in. We, the people, are the support for what it is they are doing, because we have given over our power cycle, that vertical axis of the chart. As the week continues, Mercury and the Sun are coming closer and closer together. Venus is working its way toward a hat change as it slips on this day, Thursday, because Venus is moving along. What speed is Venus moving right now? Venus is moving at a little over a degree a day. And if you look at Venus here, it only has 7 minutes to go until it steps across that line into Virgo. And when it gets into Virgo, it's not necessarily going to be, jumping for joy and doing the happy dance to be in Virgo. It's not happy in Virgo. One of the phrases for it from the Hellenistic astrology is that Venus is in fall when it's in Virgo. And one of the descriptions of fall that, when I heard it to begin with, I didn't even remember where it was, is that when a planet is in fall, it's like it's at the bottom of a well. It's yelling for help to get out of the well, but it can't be heard. So Venus going into Virgo on this Thursday of this week is like it's, stepping from the land of Leo, where the requirement is to make a pronouncement to the world. Here I am, pay attention to me. I have an entertaining thought for you to consider. This is Leo, ruled by the sun. There's a lot of energy available to draw on. Stepping across that line into Virgo is like, what happened? How come all of a sudden, people aren't paying attention to me? We're still in Mercury retrograde cycle, so is it any surprise that people aren't listening to you now? Oh no, it just amplifies that Venus going into fall in Virgo. It's still Venus. It still wants to participate with others. And in a Virgo way, it thinks along logical lines as to how things might function better. But can it communicate it? Well, we would have to ask, what's the ruler of Virgo? Mercury. Well, what's Mercury doing? Mercury is doing its retrograde dance. Therefore, people aren't listening really clearly to one another. So this fall energy for Venus at this time is I don't feel the happy dance of the interaction capacity that people will have with one another when Venus steps across that line. And, just for a little extra energy this week, on Saturday, I don't remember when it was, on the 7th. 7th? Yeah, it's Neptune that I'm looking at, because as the 6th becomes the 7th this week, Neptune goes into its retrograde cycle. One more planet in the retrograde dance. A reconsideration of Neptunian factors, that potentially hard to fathom energy where illusion can step into the equation at any moment and not present a clarity if one is perhaps just a little too hung up on the physical direction things are going in. The version from our Mercury retrograde thing, as well as our Neptunian perspective, is not going to spawn clarity. Mars, the ruler of the sign where Neptune is, it's kind of still hanging relatively close to that Uranus in Gemini, and so you can kind of feel that Mercury retrograde ruler of, Gemini, and this Mars energy, which is the ruler of where Neptune is, which just went retrograde, has to reconsider, as best it can, through the swamp of illusion for Aryan Mars energies, that, there's a certain restlessness that is in play there, Mars and Uranus together in Gemini, that could affect our conversations during a Mercury retrograde cycle. You bet. And so Neptune's just kind of going, I can easily see that people who have a potentially more substantial spiritual signature to their understanding of beingness may not be quite as affected by this Neptune going retrograde. I think that's a personal thing, though, that each of us has to ask ourselves. Am I so hung up in the material side of life that I have been disillusioned so much of the spiritual perspective of life that I can't find it? That's an individual thing, and that has a lot to do with, how is your chart makeup put together with the meanings of the house experiences that you were born with, and what does that mean for you right now? That's something that needs to be looked at by a qualified astrologer who can actually look at your house meanings and the dance of the life experience that you're going through. Always, always, always something very interesting to pay attention to. So, as the weekend goes on, we get to Sunday. Here it is. Sun and Mercury conjunct 20 degrees of Cancer. This is like the reinitiation of a solar vitality with a mercurial perspective, beginning a synodic cycle of what it is that they are going to set in motion as being meaningful for their next cycle of thinking, communicating, having conversations with that solar core of who we each are. It's in Cancer. You can almost sense a question attempting to surface in this moment. What does home mean to you? How might I communicate this with enough charisma to actually carry the weight of my foundation, my home, my understanding of my connection to my ancestors, to the piece of land that I live on, to the globe, which is really our home. That's all I got for this week. I chose this image of a painting that I did, I don't even know, many years ago, of the birthing of something new being guided, being connected to the two whales, a consciousness of an oceanic level of awareness. That's all I got. So good luck with this week. Happy birthday to the United States of America. And I trust that we make it an appropriate step going forward. There are factors that require our attention, that require the needs that we were born for to actually be on the table for consideration. Thanks.